Uh, my name's John O'Donnell. I am an ecologist with the National Park Service in Anchorage, and I'm a federal co-lead of the Permafrost Community of Practice. And so today, this webinar is part of a discussion series led by IARPC, the IARPC Modeling Community of Practice, focused on Arctic biases in U.S. Earth system models. And so today we're specifically going to be focusing on permafrost and the permafrost carbon feedback as components of the Arctic and the Earth system. And as federal co-lead of the Permafrost Community of Practice, I just want to thank the Modeling Community of Practice for hosting these series and inviting us to participate today. And the webinar is going to have three main sections. First, we're going to have Christina Schädel is going to give a short talk focused on her recent comment article in Nature Climate Change titled Earth System Models Must Include Permafrost Carbon Processes. And then second, we're going to have a series of brief updates from Modeling Center representatives focused on permafrost carbon parameterizations in different models. And there will be representatives from NCAR, Lawrence Berkeley, NASA, UAF, NOAA, and the EPA. And finally, at the end, we'll hopefully have some time for discussion. I did want to let the community of practice leads introduce themselves real quick. Maybe we can start with Wilbert.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Wilbert Weyer, Los Alamos National Laboratory. I'm co-leading the Modelers Community of Practice together with Richard and Reno Joseph. Thank you, John.
Hey, Richard.
I'm Richard Cullither. I'm with University of Maryland at College Park and NASA Goddard Space Flight Center with the Global Modeling and Assimilation Office. And I'm calling in from Greenbelt, Maryland. And I'm a co-lead for the modeling team with Wilbert and Renew.
Okay, and is Renew on? Okay.
I don't think she is.
Okay. I know Lauren is on.
Hi, I'm Lauren Boldrick. I'm one of the Permafrost co-leads, and I work for Region 10, EPA, and we're really interested in contamination that's happening in human health as related to permafrost. So glad to be here with all of you and talk about this. Thanks.
And Kyle?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Kyle Arndt. I'm at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, one of the permafrost co-leads, studying mostly greenhouse gas emissions from Arctic ecosystems. So really excited for this talk today.
Okay, I'm not sure about Ben or Ava. So, oops. Okay, well, let's move on to Christina. I'd like to introduce Dr. Christina Schädel. She is a senior research scientist at Woodwell Climate Research Center. She earned her master's from the University of Vienna and PhD from the University of Basel in Switzerland. And prior to joining Woodwell, she was an assistant research professor at Northern Arizona University and was the coordinator of the Permafrost Carbon Network. And she also served as co-lead of the IARPC Permafrost Community of Practice for many years, and we're happy to have her back today to speak about her recent work. So go ahead, Christina.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it, and I appreciate that I'm getting the opportunity here to talk about why Earth system models must include permafrost carbon processes. And I like that we had to have a very short title, so we had to use the word must to give it its importance. So I like that. I am going to skip pretty much everything about why permafrost is important, what permafrost is, and how much carbon is in there. I'm going to assume that most everyone knows this in the call, and we just want to have time to really think about the other things. Next slide. Why do we care if permafrost carbon processes are included in models? When we're looking here at this graph from the summary for policymakers from the latest IPCC report, published in 2021, we see this linear relationship between global surface temperature increase on the y-axis and cumulative CO2 emissions on the x-axis. So there's a very clear linear increase, which we all know about. And the IPCC gives a high confidence to the fact that additional ecosystem responses to warming that are not yet fully included in climate models, such as CO2 and methane fluxes from wetlands, permafrost thaw, and wildfires, would further increase concentrations of these gases in the atmosphere. So if we want to think, or if we have to think about how much carbon we have left in the carbon budget that we can admit to stay within certain warming levels, we also need to account for these emissions from permafrost thaw, and models are our tools to predict how much carbon will be coming out of permafrost. So that's why we really need to account for all these processes in models. Next slide. I'm going to stick a little bit with what the IPCC has summarized, because that's really what is being used by policymakers. So there is very high confidence that permafrost temperatures have increased to record high levels in since 1980 to the present. That's not surprising because there's enough data out there that shows this. There is a medium confidence that Arctic and boreal permafrost contains 1,400 to 1,600 gigatons of organic carbon. That's mostly because the Arctic is such a huge area and it's really hard to measure carbon everywhere. So there's just a lot of uncertainty. And then there's medium evidence with low agreement, according to the IPCC, how much of the carbon is being emitted in the form of methane and CO2 when permafrost is thawing. So that's not good enough. Medium evidence doesn't give the urgency that is required. Next slide. When we're looking at the projected changes that are reported in the IPCC report, there is very high confidence that widespread permafrost thaw is happening and will happen in this century and beyond. But there is medium confidence that permafrost carbon will be emitted as CO2 and methane to the atmosphere by 2100. So that's definitely, medium confidence doesn't cause enough urgency, and it means that permafrost carbon is often even omitted from policy conversations. Next slide. Please, thank you. Here we're looking at projected loss of permafrost in the coupled model into comparison project 6, CMIP 6. We have on the y-axis the permafrost anomaly, in permafrost extent anomaly, and on the x-axis global mean temperature anomaly, and the different lines represent different models. So there's a 10 to 40% decrease in permafrost per 1 degree Celsius warming of global mean surface air temperature. And as you see, the models do agree that stronger warming leads to more permafrost loss. So on the physical side, there is a pretty good agreement of what's happening. It's just there is variation, and that's not surprising. Next slide. Now we're looking at ecosystem carbon as represented in the permafrost model into comparison that was performed under the umbrella of the Permafrost Carbon Network and then published in 2018. Here we only have 5 models, and those are the ones that are permafrost enabled. They show cumulative change in carbon storage on the y-axis, and then years up to 2300. So it goes really far into the future. And it is much less clear here whether there is a net gain or net loss of carbon. So as soon as we go to the carbon story of permafrost, models just don't agree as much. And when you focus on 2100, 2 models even show a huge gain in carbon, and the other 3 show a minimal loss. But the further you go into the future, the more carbon loss is predicted. And some of the variation seen in these models is because of the way CO2 fertilization is promoting plant growth in the Arctic in the models, and then also varying soil moisture responses. And yeah, this was published in 2018. So the question is, how much have models improved since the PCN MIP, and have they improved at all? And we'll hear probably a little bit more from all the other modeling teams, what they are doing. And next slide, please. So after that PCN MIP, the IPCC report got published, and then, well, that's not quite a causal relationship, but here we're looking at the properties of the CMIP 6 Earth system models, 11 of them that focus on land and ocean carbon cycle components. And when you're looking at the permafrost carbon row, there is way more no's than yeses. There are 2 yeses. There's one for CESM2 and one for the NOR ESM2 land model. Both of these models have the same land component, so there's really very little diversity in model representation. But at least those 2 have permafrost carbon included to some extent. Next slide. And a goal would really be to have all of these models have a yes in there. And we've had multiple conversations. Why are models not fully including permafrost processes? Why aren't they? Why is it not more prioritized given how important it is for the global carbon cycle? And so we ended up writing this comment piece for Nature Climate Change that deals with or addresses what are the challenges with modeling permafrost processes and what are the model development needs? Is there something that can be changed about it? And then we also thought about what are the solutions, because we don't want to just think about the problems. We also want to focus on how can we solve it. Next, please. So I've grouped the challenges into 3 parts. You all probably know that the permafrost region is really large, that there's a lot of landscape heterogeneity, and the changes that are occurring with global warming, they are not occurring uniformly, and that presents a big challenge, of course. So it is unclear, it's not unclear, but it is hard to model where the landscape becomes drier and wetter because we don't even know it from enough measurements. But it has a big impact because there is more CO2 or methane, the ratio of CO2 versus methane release changes when the landscape is drier or wetter. So it's a component that is very crucial to have well represented. Then another challenge is to have good data products that are needed for benchmarking. You need spatially and temporally well put together data sets. Currently, there are data sets out there, and I don't want to say that the data sets are the limiting factor for all of this, but they are contributing to improving models. And so right now, there's a lack of spatially distributed data sets. So we would like to have a better disturbance data set that really covers where abrupt thaw and thermokarst is occurring. Then we all know that there are very large regional gaps, mostly in Siberia, and that may not change that quickly. There are some data sets out there that exist, but they are not that great. And one of them is the ground ice distribution map. Even within our ARPIC, actually, we've had quite a few conversations. How can we increase and improve the ground ice distribution maps? And I don't think we've made that much progress so far. And then there have been a few new data sets coming out, the ABC Flux database and the BALT database they were published in the last few years. So there just hasn't been enough time yet to really incorporate them into models and to use them for benchmarking. So we call them underutilized data sets, but they're out there, and that's actually a big progress. Next slide. Another major part is that models have become really complex. I'm showing here schematics of CLM, the Community Land Model version 5. There are just so many processes, which is a good thing. I'm not saying that's not a good thing. It's just, it means it gets much more complex and more difficult. And if you're changing something, it might have an impact on another process, and you just need a lot more resources to deal with that. And you need a lot of time to also identify what you're changing when you're including a new process. It also becomes more difficult to do good model benchmarking and model evaluation. The more complex a model becomes, and then it just takes a lot longer to learn and contribute to a model. Next slide. And that might be one of the main challenges that is happening right now, that there is not enough time and resources in the form of dollars available right now to really tackle all of these problems. This photo here shows a group photo from a workshop that we hosted last September at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. It's most of these people are all permafrost modeling experts, and it was really great having them all together in the same place. And we had lots of conversations about how can we improve permafrost modeling. And everyone agrees that the general short project duration that is common in the current funding landscape is just not quite enough for what is needed to really push for better model development. So the challenge is that a longer time commitment is needed to train new members. Generally, people have complained, I want to say, that if you hire a new postdoc, it takes a while to understand how a model works. It takes a while to learn the coding language. And then you have a little bit of time to actually do some of the changes and maybe include a new process, but then you need to test it, you need to write a publication, you need to go to conferences and present it, and then you want to share it with the community, putting it on GitHub or something, and all of that just takes a lot more than generally 3 years, and that's the normal funding cycle that is common these days. You need skilled experts, and it takes a while to become a skilled expert. And then once you are a skilled expert, you generally are a little more expensive than a postdoc. And that means you get less time on a grant, and then you have less time to actually do something. So we really think that the current 3-year funding cycle is insufficient to improve permafrost model representation quickly. And additionally, it has also been more common in the last years that model development is added on to a project rather than prioritized. So generally, people propose a new field study, a new experiment to collect a lot of data, and then they also add on a few months of maybe a postdoc that will do some model runs to see how that compares to what is observed in the field. I am guilty myself of having written these grants, so I'm not trying to blame anyone. I'm just trying to, we were trying to identify why some of the model development is not happening fast enough. Next slide, please. Part of the workshops that we've hosted for the Permafrost Carbon Network, and then also just in communication with modeling teams, we thought about which processes, permafrost processes, are represented in Earth system models and how well are they represented. So the 3 columns go from poor representation on the very left to better representation on the right. So nothing is perfect. And so we didn't say good representation, it's better than poor. And I'll explain a few of these processes in the next few slides. Next one. You can go and have a look at that table or figure in the paper. I don't want to talk about everything today. We split our the processes that need to be improved into physical processes that affect the carbon cycle, and then biogeochemical processes itself. For physical processes, one of the main ones is that models currently account for gradual top-down thaw, but they do not account for abrupt thaw or subsidence. So thermokarst and abrupt thaw exists or happens when there's ice-rich permafrost, and that can cover large areas, but it is hard to know when it is happening and where it is happening, and it's just a very complex process. So it's not surprising that it's not included in models, but it can increase carbon release from permafrost by up to 40% if you also account for abrupt thaw. And that just means it's a really crucial process to have included, and it would be a goal to provide the models with to have this included in models in a good way. Additionally, subsidence is another thing that isn't really presented in models, and it means that when the ground subsides because the ice is melting, generally more carbon is thawed, and more carbon at warmer temperatures means there can be more carbon released to the atmosphere, and that is also just not accounted for. You also see that the publications here are relatively young publications, so there hasn't been enough time to incorporate all of that now that we know how important it is, but we do know it is important, and so we need to prioritize it. Next slide. Part of physical processes that affect the carbon cycle are also are hydrological ones. As I mentioned, there's a lot of ice content in some permafrost areas, and when the ice melts, then we have these thaw-induced changes in hydrology, which cause either drying or wetting of the landscape, and that's poorly represented. Lateral transport is also not quite there yet. And when it comes to snow, the vertical snow structure that has this insulative insulative capacity is not represented. This means just that with the wind that is really cold, it compacts the snow, and then you have these different insulative layers, and it's differently represented across the landscape, and that's not represented in models, which is understandable because it is complicated, but it does have a huge impact on how warm or what the temperature is in permafrost. So it's something that is partially in the models, but it's not well represented and needs a lot of improvements. Next slide. For biogeochemical processes, we focus a little bit on soil processes, which are, so soil organic matter decomposition is included in the models. It needs a little bit of improvement, and particularly microbial processes should be accounted for as well, given that there have been enough studies that really show if you include microbial processes, you're getting soil organic matter decomposition much more accurately. And for plant processes, it would be important to have a good representation of Arctic plant functional types. And it's also necessary to include how these vegetation types change over time, because with warming, you're ending up with different representation of plant functional types in different areas. And because plants take up a lot of carbon, it would be important to have that represented in a reasonable way. And then currently, some of the models at least really overestimate how much CO2 fertilization will help with carbon uptake in plants. And so it looks like a lot more carbon is actually taken up by plants, and it overcompensates how much carbon is released from soil organic matter decomposition. There are enough field studies from non-Arctic areas that show that CO2 fertilization is not an unlimiting thing that is just going on forever. There are lots of other limitations that need to be accounted for. And then nutrient-plant interactions need to be improved because they also matter for how much carbon is being taken up by plants. And wildfire permafrost interactions are entirely missing. That's another thing that could potentially contribute a lot to carbon release from permafrost, and it's missing. It's not represented at all. Next slide. So to summarize all the challenges that we identified, mostly there are many processes that are important that are missing, and other processes need to be better represented. Then there's an underutilization and sometimes also a lack of high quality data sets. And we could do a improved collaboration with data teams. Then models have become really complex. That presents lots of challenges to really have enough people understand how to improve a model. Projects tend to be relatively short, and that doesn't really give enough time to include and work much on new model development. And then there is a lack of funding for skilled developers and model users. You really need to provide dedicated funding for model developers. And last slide, please. In the end, what we identified that is needed is that, we are asking for dedicated funding for model development, really a focus on providing money, dollars to develop the models and not just write the next interesting science paper, which is also important, but you really need to do the legwork of model development as well. And then we're advocating for longer term projects that allow for model development, testing, and then publishing of results. We're also advocating for a continued coordination and communication amongst different modeling teams. There is some of that is occurring, but it needs to continue, and there is a push for people to share their modules so that not every team is inventing the same thing on their own. And that also requires a lot of coordination and communication. And I want to say that what I've outlined here is an issue that, or like our issues that are occurring for US models, but also international modeling teams. This is not a US focused problem. The funding cycle and not enough dedicated funding also occurs in other modeling centers, at least according to conversations we've had. And yeah, that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. That was awesome. You really did an awesome job of summarizing a lot of the issues and in a very concise way. So I think I might hold off for questions until we have the discussion at the end, if that's okay. So the first modeling center representative is Will Wider from NCAR, and Will jump in here.
Well, thanks. Christina, it's great to hear somebody who I don't think of as being a model developer talk so much about wanting model development. So thank you. Yeah, so Dave asked me to come and provide an update on CESM and specifically CESM 3. And this isn't really to throw cold water on the state of permafrost science, but I think it is, at least for me, a good reminder that just because we have many of the processes that are kind of first order importance for permafrost representation, we can't forget about the above ground side too. And so what have shown here is just a map on the left of MODIS LAI. I'm not saying that this is absolute truth, but most of the Arctic is vegetated. And then when we looked at our development branch of CESM3, the next coupled version of CESM that is slated for CMIP 7, there's huge areas of dead Arctic permafrost regions, shown by the dark blue areas on the right, which was a feature also in CESM 2 and one that we are trying to address. So if you can advance a little bit, I think there's an animation that didn't show up. And so what we've identified is that in the coupled model, we have kind of persistent snow that lasts through the summer. And even though soils are snow covered, they also tend to be quite cold. And this anemic vegetation. So, on the land modeling side, it's easy to throw this back at the atmospheric and ocean communities and say, hey, our model's too cold and too snowy. You're killing our plants. Let's make it better. But there also are some feedbacks. And so we did some other experiments showing that when we do have living vegetation in the Arctic, there is a feedback that warms the whole region. And so what we're trying to do with this set of experiments is make the Arctic less dead. So we're doing that by changing snow albedo, also changing snow thermal conductivity, and then making some PFT, some plant functional type and phenology changes. And so, kind of to Christina's point that permafrost, we tend to think about the soil processes that are involved, but this had a lot to do above ground, really, with snow and plants. So you can go to the next slide, which I think just shows, we've reduced the dead Arctic vegetation in these coupled runs by 54%. So there's a lot less dark blue areas. You'll also notice that there's a lot of red creeping in the middle plot, which is just to say that, potentially our carbon cycle is being a little bit overdone. So there's some opportunities for calibration here. But it's just to show that we can bring back this dead vegetation. And if you go one more slide, it kind of points to some of the coupled model feedbacks that at least as I typically just run offline simulations, so land only runs. And in the top left-hand plot, it's showing that we're increasing leaf area index and melting snow faster. So the snow's not persisting anymore. That changes the hydrology of the whole region. This is for part of the Russian Arctic. So runoff is happening earlier with a stronger peak. And then that has feedbacks on albedo and on the energy budget of the whole Arctic. So changes in albedo and incoming solar radiation. So we're changing clouds by having more vegetation that has higher evapotranspiration rates and pretty big feedbacks. I think that's it. You can go for the quick CESM update.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. I think Bill Riley is next from Lawrence Berkeley.
Sure. So I'll give an update on some of the ELM work, and just to make the point, first of all, that this work is being done across a lot of the national labs, not just at Berkeley Labs. So I've tried to pull together what I know about that work. The other thing that I think is kind of important about our ELM development is that we really try to leverage more mechanistic, fine-scale process models to either directly incorporate modules into ELM or to understand better what needs to be simplified for the land models. And we use models like Ecosys and ATS, and working on a coupling of those two models to help us with that effort. The charge here was to talk about bias reduction efforts. So you can go to the, I animated this, but go to the next couple. So I broke it into, well, not that far, go back. Yeah, so I broke it up into two quick sections here. The first on process representations, which I'll mention in the second slide. But we also have a lot of work going on developing observational data sets and constraints, both for things like calibration and benchmarking, but also for developing new physics-informed machine learning approaches, for example, for the methane model. So there's just a few examples here of what we're doing. Part of this work is being done in NG Arctic, which is a large DOE-funded effort in coming into its phase 4. Where we use the International Land Model Benchmarking Project, and CESM is also involved in this effort to work with ILAM, I should mention. But now we're bringing in specific data sets for the high latitudes to do these evaluations and site level observations. So a lot of ILAM is focused on global scale products, and now we're trying to bring in more site level observations. And then I wanted to mention the WarpMap project, which is being led by Christina, and that's sort of a concept of using, and I'm glad to see Will is here too, because he's advocated for this, using perturbation experiments to test the models, because it's often easy to calibrate these models for contemporary observations. It's, although complicated, as Will just showed, it's much harder to get the perturbation responses. And so we're trying to develop metrics for that. We'll go to the next slide, please. And so here are some of the process representations that are being developed in the model now. The first one I think is pretty important is the demographic representation of vegetation. And there's a slide here with an animation from Sarah Lee Coven's recent paper called, the model's called FATES, and it's integrated in ELM. It's also integrated into CLM. And then we're also using the process-based model Ecosys to inform how, for example, how to integrate nutrient constraints, because it has a much more process-oriented representation of some of that biogeochemistry. There are a couple of efforts in ELM to actually represent transects, and then you can do hill slope hydrology and try to inform scaling. We have efforts to include microbially explicit slow organic matter decomposition. We're taking that largely from Ecosys and the modules that are developed in there, integrated into ELM. There's work on fire. Christina mentioned a bunch of these in her talk, and how fire affects microbes and affects vegetation. There's a lot of work on methane, wetland methane ongoing, including these physics-informed neural network. I'm sorry, they're neural network, broadly machine learning approaches to prediction of methane emissions, for example. And then there's ongoing work in the thermokarst, some of which is at this point just in models like ATS and Ecosys, but we're slowly moving toward incorporating that into the transect or hill slope scale models in ELM. And so that's all I was going to say in my intended 2 minutes, but I may have gone over, sorry.
Thanks, Bill.
Sure.
So next up is I have Yana Kolasa from NASA. Which I'm not sure if she has slides.
I have
think
slides.
it's on DL slides.
Yeah, let me actually, Yana, do you mind if we put you at the end just so I don't have to switch between these? Okay.
No problem.
Okay, so is Elena?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for inviting us. We're new to this community, and DFDL is known for climate, but in terms of land modeling and carbon cycling, we're a really small shop, but we do a lot of stuff independently, and I think we have some interesting results. I tried to summarize what we do and use Christina's graphics actually to show what we have. Green boxes means we already have some capability, implemented in CMIP6 models in ESMs, which has actually been run through hundreds of years, all sorts of different simulations, and the data from these models available through, CMIP6 distribution. Pink boxes means that it's something we're working now in intending to include in ESMs and CMIP7. So, and I was surprised actually to find out we have done something that what Christina considers poorly represented. We do have dynamic vegetation model. We do have interactive wildfire, which not necessarily burns peat, but it burns litter and burns vegetation. Snow distribution insolation also included, and we have improved models already, but I think many models actually have multi-snow layer, which do actually insulate soils. So we also have a dynamic land tiling, which could have tiles after fire, after land use, and now we're introducing geomorphologic tiles due to hill slopes, which also exist. So one of our major challenges is to get microbial soil carbon dynamics running stably. We tried to do it in CMIP6 with the corpse model, and that model did some things well, but we discovered it's very hard to stabilize it. So what we're doing basically, we adopt and mimics equations, the ones which use an NCAR model, and try to sort of have this hybrid or Frankenstein, it depends how you think about it, about our model soil structure and the equations for microbial soil interactions. The thing we also including is more plant functional types, particularly for Arctic forces, and like processes like photosynthesis, which will control like mosses and lichens, because you cannot just use traditional C3, C4 photosynthesis. You need to include interactions with snow and water. And what's on the right column, we've also been including in CMIP4 model, those are green boxes. But the fact that we include it doesn't mean that we do it extremely well. Right, so there's still large structural and parametric uncertainty in these models. Next, please. So this slide, I tried to actually add something that we found hard to do, but it's not necessarily was mentioned in Christina's article. See, losing carbon, one could probably do from permafrost, but the hardest thing is actually to make that carbon. And one need to realize when you run these ESMs, particularly for CMIP6, for present day and future simulation, not necessarily for paleo runs, you always do these control experiments in 1850 world, and you start cold from both like empty vegetation, empty carbon pools, and you try to basically develop these carbon storages in vegetation and soils. And we obviously know that what the permafrost carbon which we have in the present day, it's not necessarily happened with the climate which system experienced in 1850. So this is a huge challenge actually. How do you initialize these models? And one thing we've been thinking, but we really need to have sort of broader discussion with community, is it possible to do it from observations? And I think even the models like CLM5, which mix carbon when it's frozen with cryoturbation, not necessarily produce the distribution which you observe, right? So it's some huge challenge for community. Another thing we discovered, the stability of soil's carbon model with microbes. Because once you add microbes, like you not necessarily be able to produce like equilibrated carbon on the timescales of 500 years for a variety of reasons. So it's something that maybe we could collectively discuss between the climate centers, which include microbes. Thing which is also not mentioned, but we found hard to deal with sometimes, and it does matter for everything, for fires, for the soil carbon, is litter dynamics. Because litter sometimes is overlooked because it just sometimes assumed that it just goes into soil, but in reality, it's affected by moisture, it's affected by microbial dynamics, and depending like what you do with those, you can end up with very different numbers in terms of fires, for example, or in terms of where your carbon is. And the peat formation itself. I don't know if people realize that most of the climate models have a fixed depth soil column. You could make it 10, 20, 200 meters, but still it's usually just the structured layers. How do you form peat from the litter which falls on the surface, and how you show that like sort of accumulation of the peat through spin up or through earlier like period simulation? It's not clear. And I don't think there are like easy examples in the literature how to do it. People do it in a box model, but how to do it in a vertically distributed column, it's actually not trivial. Plant diversity has been mentioned. wildfires will actually underpredict, and it's one of the issues with all fire models, because it's cold, it's kind of wet, but the observation shows more fires than what we actually most of models are able to simulate. It's open challenge. And obviously you have climate biases as well added. So how do you deal with that, particularly temperatures or precipitation or like too many clouds? So I think like for us, we would really like to have input from community, both from modelers and the process understanding. And we need sometimes just parameterization or knowledge, like basic knowledge, how does the system work? And obviously we would welcome more observations. It's sometimes just, it's not obvious sometimes where to find these observations. You read the literature, but having some sort of central portal for observations would be super useful. And we would love to see some sort of climate process team, which been popular in atmospheric, ocean, and even land communities, which bring together not just modelers, but people who understand processes, or who actually have parameterizations which modelers could use, or research communication networks like the one we had before, through NSF funding, where we had opportunities to meet more frequently and be supported. So hopefully like these interactions could lead to those. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elena. Is Tanya there?
I'm not sure if you're asking for me, but my name is Tanya.
Yes, did you have something you wanted to present from the EPA?
I do not at this time. Unfortunately, I got this meeting note and I was on leave for a week and a half, so I did not have time to prepare something in time to get it cleared.
Okay, no worries. I guess the last presenter would be Jana.
Yeah, thank you. Could you go to my first slide, please? Thank you. Oh, okay. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just to introduce myself, my name is Jana Kolasa. I'm a land model developer at the Global Modeling and Assimilation Office at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of what we're doing in terms of carbon modeling in permafrost regions, and also what we're working on in trying to address biases and carbon estimates in these regions. So just to give an introduction, since I'm not sure people are familiar with it that much, but our main carbon model is Catchment CN. It is the experimental land component in our NASA Goddard Earth Observing System, or GEOS. And experimental, I mean here in the sense that we do use this model for science applications, but it is not currently incorporated in any of our operational systems, so like our forecasting system or our reanalysis system. Catchment CN is actually a hybrid model. It is a merger between the catchment land surface model, which is the land surface model in our operational systems, and then carbon and nitrogen dynamics from the community land model, CLM, which you heard about from Will a little bit. In this hybrid configuration, catchment is the model that computes all the water and energy balances, and the CLM routines are used to compute the carbon and nitrogen fluxes and the reservoirs. Next slide, please. So we do have some work that has been done in trying to improve permafrost specifically, or the representation of permafrost in our model. This has been implemented by Jing Tao at the University of Maryland, and has been implemented for the catchment land surface model, so the model that does not have dynamic vegetation. So they have implemented a number of different changes to the model to try and better represent permafrost, the permafrost in the model. One of the things they implemented was to account for the impact, for example, of soil carbon on soil thermal properties, in order to be able to get a more realistic representation of subsurface thermodynamics in the model. And they did find that by doing that, you did get a better representation. For example, you got an improved representation of the active layer thickness, and I'll refer you to the paper that is cited here for more details. Now, this version of the model currently exists in sort of a sandbox state, where it's like available, but it is not integrated into our GEOS modeling suite yet. Next slide, please. So this was it about the models, and now I just want to briefly talk a little bit about what we're doing in trying to address biases in our carbon estimates. So for us, the first step, of course, is trying to identify the sources of errors, and on the flip side, the sources of predictability in carbon estimates in our model. And so my colleague Anjali has implemented a number of withholding experiments in order to try to identify the importance of different predictors for seasonal carbon forecast skill. And what she found was that in high latitude and permafrost regions, the snow initialization was one of the main predictors. And that is simply because by having a better snow initialization means we're better able to predict the snow removal date, and that in turn allows us to have better predictions of carbon estimates. In non-permafrost regions, we also found that the carbon reservoir initialization itself was an important predictor. Next slide, please. So having identified sources of errors and predictability, we of course want to try to address some of the issues that we know exist in our modeling system. And there are two different pathways we can take. One is of course model development. So for example, by implementing this permafrost module that I've shown on the previous slide. But the other pathway we take a lot is trying to constrain our model with observations, in particular through data assimilation. And so, for example, to improve our snow initialization, there has been work recently conducted by my colleague Lauren Andrews. She has implemented a MODIS-based snow albedo boundary condition and also a MODIS snow cover fraction assimilation. And what she finds is that by implementing the MODIS snow cover fraction assimilation, she is able to reduce the biases and the unbiased RMSE in our snow cover fraction estimates in the model. So that is shown in the two maps here. Everywhere you see a red color, we basically improve the model skill over the open loop, which doesn't have the assimilation of the MODIS observations. And then the last point that I want to mention, and a different approach we often take, is to try to improve carbon estimates by assimilating soil moisture observations, because soil moisture is one of the key variables when it comes to land-atmosphere interactions and surface fluxes. And so this is done, for example, in the context of the SMAP level for carbon product. So what we do for this product is we assimilate observations from the soil moisture active passive or SMAP mission into our GEOS system in order to produce better estimates of soil moisture. And then these improved soil moisture estimates are handed to our collaborators at the University of Montana, who run these estimates through their carbon model in order to produce the SMAP level for carbon product, which is also available globally, so including high latitude and permafrost regions. And I have cited the reference here in case you're interested in this product. And I think that's my 2 minutes, so thank you.
Thanks, Jana, and thanks to all the Modeling Center representatives. We definitely fit a lot in a short amount of time, so appreciate all of that. We've got about 8 minutes left in the hour, and yeah, we'll take some questions. Wilbert?
No, sorry, it was my clapping hands. Looks like Richard has a legitimate hand up.
Should I ask a question? One of the things I think that has not been mentioned has been initialization and the expense of that. I think one of the chief obstacles for implementation, I guess, with the GMAO has been expense. So if you're trying to represent permafrost, as Ellen has said, Earth system models usually have a fixed column of layers of soil that go down, for some depth. Permafrost, of course, acts much slower, and so the response to the atmosphere is much slower. So you would have to have a lengthy coupled initialization, or I guess you could do an offline initialization and then couple it. You would then have a mismatch between the climate that the land surface is expecting and the Earth system model. Is initialization actually an important issue, and what methods have been used to try to circumvent that?
But can I just clarify something? Because when we run the land models offline or online, carbon usually build into this vertical structure. But my understanding that a lot of the carbon in the permafrost there is not just from this vertical sort of processes, because during the glacier expansion and retreat, there was a lot of sort of soil carbon which was scraped down across the latitudes, right? So, and it's not just 1850 climate, there was like different, you know, climate long-term variability events. So the question is the carbon which we have in these columns and permafrost, I don't think it just came from this vertical deposition and mixing. That's what the models do now. And that's why I think initializing from the data might help us to kind of circumvent this missing processes like glacier expansion and retreat, which we don't do, right?
Yeah.
So, but
You know,
I'm not an expert on the where did carbon come from on paleoclimates. So maybe it's something that we need to have discussion with the experts from. We could run it longer. It's not a problem. The question is like, how do you force it?
Yeah, Elena, I'll just say I totally agree with your sentiment. I think we've confused ourselves for decades now that the models will produce a reasonable millennial scale carbon profile anywhere in the world. I think it's luck when it happens and we don't pay attention to it when it doesn't. So I really, we've started doing this, initializing with the best observations we have. Now I know there's the issue of the previous climate from 1850, but I think it's way better to do that. Of course, in our models, you also have to have nitrogen and phosphorus.
Right.
That's more uncertainty, but at least the vertical profiles and the overall stocks are reasonable. Now, the problem has always been, how do you get your vegetation to not be out of whack with that? But we can spin up the vegetation much more quickly than we can spin up the soil. So I think it's just obvious the way to do it. And in CLM and in ELM, we have the further problem that we initialize the soil carbon profiles for thermal and hydraulic properties, and those properties don't change, which is just obviously wrong. And so when we look at, you know, what would you infer for your hydraulic and thermal properties from your dynamic carbon cycle predictions compared to your static one, they're radically different, not surprisingly. So that's another benefit of just saying, hey, we have some information about stocks, let's initialize and then grow the vegetation consistent with that and then move forward. But the modeling centers, you know, there's so much cultural inertia in this that it's hard to, Will's laughing. I don't know, do you agree, Will, or is?
I don't know. Well, I guess I'm curious. So if you initialize from stocks, this is maybe jumping too far ahead and too technical, but if you initialize from stocks, like how do you run an ESM configuration then where you have prognostic CO2 in the atmosphere? Because it seems like you would be breaking that, or it would just take forever for you to get some sort of CO2 is constant.
You don't have to run it right away with emissions. You could run with concentrations and then get the system settled. That's what we do at least. Yeah. But maybe that we should have a separate meeting. We would love to learn from you guys, from Bill, about this SIM initialization and also about mimics. But But I think this meeting could be the beginning of other discussions which we could set.
Yeah, I particularly like this conversation because it's really poking at the deep underlying assumptions that the models have that we haven't poked at very much for a long time.
Yeah,
I think lead to problems.
And if I may add, one of the things which I didn't mark as we know how to do is ground ice.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think but it also matters for making temperature profile correctly, soil moisture profile correctly, carbon correctly. And we tried to explore how to, for example, form the ice lenses, and we couldn't find any parameterization on anybody who knows how to do or where they are, where this sort of ice formations. So if anybody knows in this community or have some idea, we would explore it, but we just don't have know-how. How does it work?
How does it form? Well, we have, Ecosys does this prognostically, Elena, but we have to initialize at a site with what's known about the massive ice.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. But how do you get that globally, right? Because it's
not easy. I mean, Christina mentioned one data set, but I think there's a lot of uncertainty in those data.
I think Brendan has his hand up.
Yeah, I realize we're running out of time, but I'm really excited about the potential for the initialization that y'all are talking about. I guess one thing I was thinking, and I'm curious what you think, is you could imagine, say for example, you initialize with observed permafrost carbon pools, and then your model shows a loss of those carbon pools over the sort of, historical and future period. So one, that could be because of the climate, right, and the warming and all the things that we know are happening. The other possibility is just the carbon stocks you initialize your model with are not sort of the natural attractor basin of what your model would have under equilibrium under sort of any climate, whether it's like 1850 or looking at even last glacial maximum or something. And so how do you account for the changes and whether those are occurring because of actual climate change and other drivers versus your model just isn't sort of naturally at equilibrium with that level of carbon stocks? Like how would you deal with that?
Well, personally, Brendan, I don't think we've ever been at equilibrium. I mean, I think the global community always assumes that there's an equilibrium in 1850 with inputs and stocks, and that's never really happened ever.
Yeah, I agree. I guess I just mean like inconsistency between levels that the model would inherently simulate versus if you initialize with an observation. I don't know if I'm like using the right words and expressing.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, but maybe we could test it at sites where we have enough observations. If you have vegetation and soil properties at a site, your model should get there with initialization of stocks.
Yeah.
You should develop the plants that are consistent with the resources in the soil. And if it doesn't, that's a problem with the model. And maybe that's the place to start, is at the site level where we have enough information. I don't know.
Will?
Yeah, I think one of the exciting things for CMIP 7 is that, and this is, I guess, more of an announcement. I don't know if this community pays attention to CMIP 7 discussion much, but they're talking about these new these fast track experiments that will be with prognostic CO2 in the atmosphere. And so like for years, the kind of, which we've done for a long time, like this, we've done this 3 times, I guess, already. But these ESM forced runs with emissions-driven scenarios as opposed to concentration-driven are going to be core to CESM. I'm sorry, to CMIP 7. And so I think that's an exciting opportunity for this community to kind of contribute and see how permafrost fits into that story. I'm super excited about it, but it's also a little bit terrifying.
Yeah. But Elena, even if we had the massive ice data sets, there's only a few models, even non-ESM types of models, that will do anything with that information. So the models still need to move to a place where they can handle geomorphological dynamics. And there's only a couple that do that. So even if we had information.
But I think the problem bottleneck that we're all isolated in some ways, like some more than others. And I think if Christina says, you need to have this, they must have it, like we would love to have it, but it has to be some resources available to university people, because we don't get more salaries, right? But we need to have resources to support process understanding, people who have data sets. It's not like you take it and plug it, right? So I think you need some way to support this communication among different kinds of scientists. And I don't know how to make it happen.
Well, I don't remember, Dave Lawrence he's who I've heard it from, but there is an effort to try to get a library is the wrong word, but a way for people in the land modeling community to integrate their modules in a way that everybody can get at them easily. I don't know if Dave was maybe the leader of that concept, but there is LMSC, is that what they call that group?
Yeah, but
The land model
I
forum.
think it's a little bit naive,
Really? You don't think that would be valuable?
I think it's hard to take model structure. I think parameterization level, I agree, because it's just parameterization, maybe you could use it. Or if it's like parameter constraints or something, one could use it. But once you start throwing things, like even for us, with 2 different ocean models, we have 2 different climate sensitivities, the model goes haywire, right? So I think ESMs are very, very flaky when it comes.
I think that would depend on the coupling process, right? Some models have semi-implicit land atmosphere coupling, which would probably make, a plug and play type of approach for different land surface coupling more problematic, as opposed to like the NCAR explicit coupling.
We have implicit coupling, it doesn't help us.
Yeah.
I was thinking within the land model though. So Elena, for example, you're interested in a microbially explicit representation. If the land models were forced to build an infrastructure in their models with clear interfaces, we could just give you a redox cycle and you would input temperature, et cetera, and then you get back out whatever redox couple fluxes happened, whatever it is. So
We
I
could
think-
try, Bill. We could try, Bill, and
Yeah, I
see
think
how
that's-
it works. Because we have microbes, and we now change it to mimics, which is what Will uses, right?
Yeah.
And we only change equations. We keep the structure, but change equations. And we have a great, actually, carbon fluxes in terms of like, what we want. But now we have liter problem. We couldn't stabilize out. Because the liter equations seems to be like turnover rate sensitive to temperature. They're not reproducing. There's always something, right?
There's always something.
We could try,
But most of the models are not built with a clear software infrastructure that allows them to easily exchange modules. So you could test
No.
hypotheses even. It's really hard to even test hypotheses in these models sometimes.
I totally agree, Bill, but it would be a huge lift in software engineering. Like it's hard enough for us to support a couple software engineers now. And I think what you're talking about would really advance the science, but it would take a serious investment in software engineering, which is
It will, but we keep stumbling into, I mean, it's been decades now and we keep
I totally agree.
You're right. It would be an
I
investment.
totally
I
agree.
think Christina made that point in the paper that it's probably worth the investment at some point. Otherwise, I can't see it changing.
Right.
You know?
I agree with that.
Maybe initialization is something we could try because it's not the model, but at least some sort of state of the carbon we could try to use and see what our models do.
Yeah. And I'm sure you're right. We're going to find other problems with that idea too. It seems it's a shiny solution right now, mainly because we haven't tried it. We'll see.
Okay, John has dropped off. So it is now 6 after the hour. I think we'll wrap up now if that's okay with everyone, unless anyone has the last word. Okay. The IRPIC modeling teams the co-leads are all meeting this month for planning for future meetings. So I don't think we have any other announcements at this point. Meredith, is there anything else to add?
Not from my perspective. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, I'd like to thank Christina for her presentation. I'd like to thank all of the panelists and everyone who has participated in the discussion. Thanks very much. This is very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.